Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video. In this video, we will compare the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 5. This is going to be an SoC comparison video. You can take a quick look at the specifications. Both 8 Elite Gen 5 and 8 Gen 5 feature 8 physical cores. They essentially share the same architecture. Yes, the 8 Gen 5 features the same Orion core architecture that is featured in the 8 Elite tier of SoCs, which is why the naming doesn't make sense to me, because remember, Qualcomm reserved the Elite branding for products featuring the Orion core architecture. And not only that, the 8 Gen 5 features the same 3rd generation Orion cores with support for SME2 instruction set. Anyways, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is capable of hitting much higher clock speeds up to 4.6 GHz, which is just crazy. The 8 Elite Gen 5 features a bigger GPU, the Adreno 840, with more compute units, more shaders, and way more cache. Now regarding the devices, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is represented by the OnePlus 15 with 12GB of RAM, whereas the 8 Gen 5 is represented by the Moto Signature with 16GB of RAM. Now this is not a device comparison, this is a pure SoC comparison, which is why I will be using a cooler to prevent thermal throttling, which can affect the accuracy of the test. The Moto Signature is not only just half as thick as the OnePlus 15, but also they are totally different devices from different brands with different power curve tuning by the OEMs, which is why the tests will be short to compare the performance in an unthrottled test. Don't worry, we will compare different frame rates to test for efficiency as well. Okay, before we take a look at the benchmarks, here is an ideal power consumption of the two devices at same brightness level. I will deduct this from the power consumption on load to reduce errors. The 8 Elite Gen 5 has lower ideal power consumption. I don't know if it's the chip itself or that Oxygen OS is handling background tasks or processes better than Hello UI. Anyways, let's start with the couple of basic benchmarks. When it comes to CPU performance in Geekbench 6, the 8 Elite Gen 5 features a 21% higher single-core clock speed, which results in a 25% higher single-core performance. For multi-core as well, there is around a 20% gain. Overall, in Geekbench 6, the 8 Elite Gen 5 consumed 5.26 watts of power versus the 8 Gen 5, which consumed around 4.35 watts. So there is basically no difference in efficiency in Geekbench. The 8 Elite Gen 5 consumes 21% more power and scores just about as much more, almost linearly. Next, I used the CPU throttling test app to kind of try to figure out the efficiency difference, but take this with a grain of salt. I am not very confident in this. So with 20 threads engaged with roughly the same amount of performance, that is an average of around 360 giga instructions per second, the 8 Gen 5 is running its two full performance cores at an average of 3.3 GHz and the so-called efficiency cores at a steady 3.1 GHz. All in all, consuming a whopping 11.6 watts. I guess this is the price you pay for pushing the P cores to the max. Meanwhile, the 8 Elite Gen 5 was running its P cores at just around 2.6 GHz with some peaks up to 3.6 GHz, and the efficiency cores at 2.3 GHz, all in all consuming at a much lower 7.1 watts. So in this 100% CPU load scenario, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is appearing to be a lot more efficient. But again, take this with a grain of salt as both systems are using different clock speeds. The final test I did is to test the CPU efficiency and scaling is by emulating GTA 5 open world driving at lowest graphics 720p but with maximum population density and variety. First, I tested with a 40 FPS frame rate cap and both devices delivered a locked 40 FPS experience, and here the 8 Elite Gen 5 utilized around 4.95 watts of power, whereas the 8 Gen 5 consumed around 5.47 watts of power, meaning the 8 Elite Gen 5 is 10.5% more efficient. However, when I tested with uncapped frame rate, there is no difference. In fact, the 8 Gen 5 ends up being slightly more efficient. To me, this seems like a limit of the actual emulation, like the actual emulator instead of the SoC. So bottom line is that when it comes to CPU scaling, what I found is the 8 Elite Gen 5 is more efficient but only in the middle power band, as it can hit the same clock speeds as the 8 Gen 5 but using a bit less power. But at peak power band, they are about the same when it comes to efficiency. And that makes sense, both are having the same Orion core architecture, same DNA, both are built on TSMC's N3P node. It's just that the 8 Elite Gen 5 is a bit better built chip. When it comes to the CPU, the silicon is just better. Next, let's take a look at GPU performance. For peak GPU performance in 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is 30.5% faster compared to the 8 Gen 5, which in itself is around 20% faster than the outgoing 8 Gen 3 and 8S Gen 4. When it comes to power consumption, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is consuming 5% more power, making it significantly more efficient than the 8 Gen 5 when it comes to peak GPU performance. But obviously in the real world gaming, the CPU is also involved. So let's take a look at mixed CPU GPU usage. We will start with Wuthering Waves, max graphics settings, 60 FPS cap, OpenGL backend. Now, I don't know if it's the 8 Elite Gen 5 itself or it's the OnePlus 15 having problems with the game in recent times, but the CPU utilization on the OnePlus 15 is always way too high compared to the 8 Gen 5 in the Moto Signature. The GPU usage on the 8 Gen 5 is well above 80%, but it's heavily CPU bottlenecked on the 8 Elite Gen 5 with GPU usage well under 60%. The reason is for this game specifically, the OnePlus 15 is running the CPU at a very low clock speed compared to the 8 Gen 5 Moto Signature, which is causing major CPU bottleneck. But then the power consumption is the same, which is creating confusion in my mind. I don't have any other 8 Elite Gen 5 device on hand to confirm this odd behavior. So it is what it is. I compared multiple intense battle to stress test the SoCs and maybe take this results with a grain of salt, but the 8 Gen 5 behaved in a much better, more organized way, resulting in better efficiency. This is definitely an odd result in my opinion. Next, we will test Grid Legends. Now for this, I have copied the 8 Elite Gen 5 graphics preset configuration file to the Moto Signature for fair comparison, because this game actually is configured with different levels of visual fidelity depending on the SoC. So you have to make the internal configuration the same. So firstly, I capped the FPS to 40 FPS to test for mid-level efficiency. This game is clearly the most graphically intensive game on Android, and this is a good test for GPU efficiency. And at 40 FPS cap, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is 23.5% more efficient. This game is highly GPU bound, so this makes sense. At a 60 FPS cap, the 8 Gen 5 simply fails as it cannot really hit 60 FPS at a consistent basis in these conditions. Meanwhile, the 8 Elite Gen 5 can actually hit 60 FPS from time to time, so this is a clear win for the 8 Elite Gen 5. It is not fair to compare the efficiency in this case, as the 8 Gen 5 simply failed to hit the target FPS cap. On a side note though, the performance of the 8 Gen 5 seems to be around 2 FPS lesser than the original 8 Elite Gen 1. Next up is Hitman Absolution, and I want to test a very particular spot at the beginning of the game. This open garden area is puzzlingly extremely GPU intensive on Android. So starting at a 40 FPS cap to test for efficiency, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is a whopping 33% more efficient. Moving on to the 60 FPS cap, and just like in Grid Legends, the 8 Elite Gen 5 hits a GPU bottleneck. Not quite as hard as in Grid Legends, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is still a good 20% faster than the 8 Gen 5. Again, efficiency comparison doesn't make sense here because the performance gap is quite large. I also compared with a 120 FPS cap, so have a look. The 8 Elite Gen 5 can hit around 15% higher FPS. Next up is Tomb Raider, graphics preset starting with 40 FPS cap for efficiency testing. Both chipsets use very little power to hit 40 FPS locked. This is a fantastic port to play on mobile. Overall, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is 10% more efficient at this frame rate cap. At 60 FPS frame rate cap, both are again neck to neck. The 8 Elite Gen 5 is only 3% more efficient, which can be considered as a margin of error. At 120 FPS frame rate cap, the 8 Elite Gen 5 is around 15% more efficient. They pretty much consume the same amount of power, but the 8 Elite Gen 5 fetches 15 more FPS. Next we got Warframe. Now here I encountered an old bug with the OnePlus that I previously faced with CarX Street, and that is extremely low power limits. The temporary solution is to start a screen recording. This somehow lifts the power limit and the performance is top notch as expected. This issue is now solved with CarX Street, but for Warframe this exists. So efficiency numbers for this is not very accurate. Now this is a special configuration that I'm using. I will link it down below. This configuration raises the FPS cap from 60 FPS all the way to 144 FPS with maxed out graphics and way better anti-aliasing than the default options. And here both 8 Gen 5 and 8 Elite Gen 5 performs almost identically. Maybe the 8 Elite Gen 5 is slightly better. Remember, 8 Elite Gen 5 system is also recording the screen alongside playing the game. So technically it is more capable. Finally, we got CarX Street, and here we are testing max graphics 60 FPS cap, and the 8 Elite Gen 5 and 8 Gen 5 are basically the same in this game when it comes to efficiency, both consuming around 4.8 watts. So that's all about the 8 Elite Gen 5 versus 8 Gen 5 guys. Bottom line is 8 Gen 5 is a great SoC for the price. I feel more and more semi-flagships should come with this SoC as it strikes a great balance between cutting edge performance and manufacturing cost. On the other hand, I feel at least with Android games, there is more performance left to be unlocked with the 8 Elite Gen 5. I feel it's not utilized fully yet. There is more left in the tank, at least on the OnePlus 15. Probably something like a Red Magic 11 Pro will be fully able to utilize the 8 Elite Gen 5. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Next up will be the Exynos 2600 in the Galaxy S26, which is on the way. So make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Also consider hitting the like button and hyping this video. Share your thoughts below. Take care and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.